Okay, so this goes out by request, so it's really long, it's really boring, so blame the guy who requested it. But this is the complete history of communism in North Korea. This is the complete history of communism, chapter 5. So I don't know how many of you have been following along with chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3 is about Russia, chapter 4 is about China. So here we are in chapter 5, communism in Korea. I'll appreciate any and all criticisms, comments, constructive criticisms, well, even destructive criticisms. Korea is a mid-sized land, surrounded by China and Russia and Japan. A humble nation surrounded by three mighty forces. That's three mighty forces. Long ago it was known as the Hermit Kingdom. Isolated from the world, but self-sufficient, Korea had its own language and inventions and resources. But when the rest of the world reached colonial times, Europe and Japan both wanted that colonial prize. East and West wanted Korea. Who would win? It was Japan that annexed Korea in 1910. And life under the Japanese was cruel. But Korean landlords and police helped them rule. The vicious Japanese imperialists and the richest Koreans collaborated. And the first Korean communist was a woman, Alexandra Kim. She lived in Russia, but a few Koreans joined in. Maybe communism could get rid of the Japanese conquerors they all hated. And the Korean Communist Party was just a few people at best, but one was Kim Song-ju, a teenage student who got arrested. When Kim got out, he fled and joined Mao's Chinese army. He fought in China, not Korea, but he fought the Japanese. So a legend spread back in Korea about a Korean soldier fighting the Japanese in China. Kim Il-sung, meaning become the sun, was the new name of this star. And when Kim was the last commander alive in his section, and the Japanese had his troops down to just a fraction, he led his last men to safety across a river to the USSR. And so the next chapter in Kim Il-sung's life began. He left Mao's army and was retrained as a Soviet army man. He fought in Stalin's army through World War II, and when the Japanese were crushed, it was Korea's dream come true. But like Germany, after the Nazis were finished, Korea was also in question, with the Japanese banished. Would it be the communist East or the capitalist West that would give Korea direction? So, sort of like East and West Germany, a similar decision fell to cut Korea in half along the 38th parallel. The North to Stalin's Russia, and the South to America's protection. And Kim Il-sung was the leader Stalin picked for the North. Syngman Rhee was the South's leader that America put forth. And through the late 40s there was a big propaganda fight. Both called the other a puppet, and both were sort of right. Well, one big problem with North Korea, to be fair, there were very few Korean communists even there. The leaders were mostly foreigners from China and from the Soviet Union. But then on the other hand, one big problem with South Korea, to be fair, was that America put back in power all the rich Koreans there. All the same ones who collaborated with Japan came right back to rule them. And another irony is that Korea did have its own communist party, but they were based in the South, so they just couldn't get things started. Meanwhile, both leaders were pawns hoping to be kings. Both wanted permission to attack the other and conquer everything. In 1950, Kim got Stalin's permission. He sent the North Korean troops across the border on a conquering mission. The South Koreans fled, just like Kim hoped was going to happen. Except that Kim underestimated how much America was committed. He thought the US wouldn't send troops to Korea, but we did. So it was Kim's turn to flee north, because it was America's excuse to see him flattened. But then it was America's turn for a disastrous turnabout we hadn't thought thought the giant communist Chinese army would come out. So the so-called Korean War was really Americans versus Chinese, with Korea in the middle of this mini World War III. Well, America reinforced with new technology like napalm, but the Chinese seemed endless. There was even talk of using an A-bomb, and for 3 horrible years there was slaughter and neither side winning. Until China and America both backed off because they were even. But with Korean cities destroyed and millions dead for no reason, the country ended up divided exactly the same as it was at the war's beginning. And Kim still wanted more power, but he still needed Russia and China's help. The only rivals he could get rid of were Korean communists themselves. Then he told everyone to believe in Juche, his philosophy of self-reliance. And he did improve North Korea's economy and science, so North Korea prospered for a time. But by the 70s, it started to decline. Old Kim picked his son, Kim Jong-il, to lead in case of his departure. And North Korea even started nuclear power programs, but the economy just kept slowing and slowing. And in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, North Korea lost its most important partner. And sort of like a metaphor for the growing problems of his past, old Kim grew a neck tumor that had to crop out of photographs. In fact, it grew so large it even got in fights with his kid. Okay, that part didn't really happen, but it was fun to draw as if it did. And nowadays, North Korea is a hermit kingdom once again, ruled by Kim Jong-il and his army men. Isolated from the world, but even worse than it ever happened in the past. But nobody knows what's gonna happen tomorrow. Maybe North Korea will get rid of their nukes and be an example for the West to follow. Maybe something will allow the people to rise and finally decide their own fate at last. And of course that brings us right up to Complete History of Communism Part 6, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I'm not going to do that this evening. Thank you guys for sticking around to hear a long lecture on a Saturday night. Thanks a lot. We are Jeffrey Lewis, Jack Lewis. You guys are Seoul, South Korea. You've been an amazing audience. Thanks for listening.